Hello and welcome to part 2 of my conversation with Cath Kane. We've been having quite an in-depth conversation here around some areas including challenge, motivation, resilience, communications and mental health and well-being. So enjoy. I think that kind of leads me sort of naturally on because you're speaking about some terms you used earlier about empowering people and being authentic to yourself. So you talk about empowering people being the route to self-determination. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that works in action?
So I trained as a community education worker in Scotland, and I did some work in those early days around adult literacy. I also worked with children and young people, often, and some of the children who were at risk. And I also ran creative events and writing as part of positive mental health work, part of community development work. And I loved that work. I loved grassroots community education work. And from that work, I realized that I don't empower people. People empower themselves. That's the key. Because if empowering people implies you have better knowledge or more skills or the right way to do something. And actually what I found is if people get access to information, resources and opportunities that are aligned with what they want to do, aligned with their values and their purpose, then people will fly. But I've often noticed that with the access to opportunities and information and some role models, people, when you can see yourself reflected in literature, cinema, music, careers and business, then there is immediately then a barrier is lifted. Doesn't mean it's still going to be easy for you to progress in those things, but to visualize it, to see it, and to know that someone else has done it, then that's when other people start to break those records or move through those barriers. I don't know, how many years ago was it, Denise? We didn't know you could run a 4-minute mile? It was the Chariots of Fire movie was all around that, wasn't it? And no one thought they could do it. And then someone did it. They broke that time barrier and then others followed.
Say about role models, it kind of made me think, a question people often ask, I've heard asked quite a lot is, who is your role model? But if you look at it in those terms, I think it's quite interesting for me anyway to think that quite often it's just someone from Scotland that I know that's moved down south. It could be like yourself, whereas we touched on a bit earlier on that we're always taught as a race to be quite kind of, self-deprecating and a bit kind of,
yes.
Don't get ahead of yourself. So when you
yes.
see somebody like you that has done something that is Scottish and has done something, you think, well, actually, that for me is enough.
Thank you. Because we're a small country, aren't we? We're a little bit like West Highland Terriers, I think. We're small, but we bark at the big dogs across the street sometimes, don't we? We're a little bit feisty. We've got character or personality. I don't know. Maybe you don't want to be compared to a little West Highland Terrier, but I love West Highland Terriers, by the way. I like their attitude. And my grandmother was such an influence, such a major influence in my life. She had backbone. She had been born in 1910. She had come through, the Great Depression. She lived through 2 world wars. She lived through her house being bombed in the Second World War because our home city was bombed for 3 years during the Second World War. And just that generation had so much strength and resilience. And she was a woman that, despite some of those difficult experiences, she had a huge capacity to love, and I think that's also a mark, the measure of a person, because we can all be nice and pleasant when things are going well. It's when the chips are down and our liberties are taken from us, or we feel deprived. How then are we? How do we measure up in that situation?
Come up with a lot of conversations I've had with people around, especially around COVID time, where people liken it to sort of almost like wartime spirit.
Yeah. Yes.
I think there is almost something that we will come out of this, and the people who have
Yes.
been have like a sort of badge of honour that they've survived it, and the things we've learned from it. Really.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yes, I think I mentioned one of my goals is to write a book, and that's exactly what I want to do. Just to reflect back on the last 3 years and say, what really is the learning and the insights? Because that is also what creativity does. You can take a very difficult experience, and I've seen this working with survivors of abuse, you know, who have come through horrendous experiences, and they advocate for other survivors. They turn that pain and that adversity into something powerful that is changing policy and legislation and services, you know, for other survivors, because they want to share their knowledge and their insight and help. And that is an incredibly powerful thing, can be an incredibly healing thing as well, where we find something meaningful from something that's actually been quite difficult.
Yeah,
you know?
totally. I agree. So I'm interested to know how we've obviously all adapted our communication style during the past year, particularly. What have been the challenges around that? How have you adapted how you've worked? I'm particularly keen to think about where you might have worked with groups of people or more than one person at a time, because this platform can make things tricky.
Yeah, well, I've had to get used to working online, and I can remember the first webinar that I did here in the States. I hadn't presented in a webinar before, and the organization, they work nationally here in the States, and the call went out to the webinar, and they had over 2,000 inquiries or hits on the site. And on the day that we ran the webinar, there were 500 people in the room. And I remember thinking, I really don't want to think about how many people might be listening to this. I mean, I know it's not quite a TED Talk. It's not quite Brene Brown with I don't know how many million hits that she's up to now, but it was slightly intimidating, I have to say. And I just, the good thing was I was literally just looking at the screen, and as we're doing now, oh, you can see the other presenters or, you know, and nothing else in just your laptop. So it kept it in perspective for me. But really thinking about how do you maintain engagement and connection, because when you're faced in person with someone, or you're presenting or running a group in, you know, in a room, then you've got a level of intimacy or interaction that is just much easier. I think it's much easier to make that happen and make that feel like a interesting space or a safe space. So I introduced some techniques, some mindfulness techniques, because I was very conscious of the thing I was talking about, COVID. The pandemic had just hit. And what I didn't want to do was, you know, people's alert system just get into overload, because people were already concerned about COVID, and things were shutting down, and there was fear of, you know, the infection rate was really accelerating. So I used a number of mindfulness techniques just throughout the presentation or through the talk. And I also, with the help of some technical assistance from the folks that organized the webinar, I was able to just stop and pause and say, can I just check in what's anything happening on the chat? Does anyone get any feedback? And kind of just took the temperature. I know that's another very American phrase, but I did just wanted to check in and find ways of being interactive. It was not as good as being in person, but certainly was an opportunity to do that. And I started to build those into other things that I did online. The coaching on a one-to-one level, it is easier to be interactive with that when it's on a one-to-one level, but it's still important to just check in with folks where they're at any point in that session, how things are landing. Is it resonating? Have I understood you? I use a lot of reflecting back when I'm coaching, just to say, just let me check that I've understood that. Is this what you meant? And ask some questions. Good coaching is actually more about asking powerful questions and helpful questions rather than transmitting knowledge to someone. Yeah, it's all about when we find the answers ourselves. that's where real change happens, because we embody the change. It's not someone telling us that this is what you need to do. Yeah, we find it ourselves.
I think I like the tips you're using there about doing those big events as well. Because I think as someone who runs big events, I think people start to think, oh well, we're doing it online, so we can still do an 8-hour day, and it'll still be blah blah blah. Oh, we won't need as many breaks because people are just sitting there, and you think, no, you still have breaks. In fact, even more so, because the attention span, you can't just.
Yep, absolutely.
And like you say, I think it maybe also it heightens the anxiety of people reminding themselves why they're in this situation by looking at the screen all the time. So
yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's important that there's rest, there's repair, there's grounding techniques as well. I use that. Just simple things that you can do at your desk. Take 5 minutes, 2 minutes in a day, and it just calms the system down. Yeah. Refreshes your mindset.
It does bring us on to the question of mental health, which we've said one good thing about what's come out of the moment is that we're having more discussions about mental health and well-being. And I know that part of the work you do is big part of what you do is checking in on others to see how their mental health and well-being are.
Yeah.
And what are you noticing about how people's mental health has been affected over this past year?
Well, I think it's interesting the word mental health comes with a stigma, doesn't it? Even if we're trying to use it in a positive way, there's still a lot of ignorance or stigma around mental health because we think of the extreme cases, or we maybe have got some preconception in our mind. Last time I looked at statistics, out of the whole global population, 1 in 4 of us is likely to have mental health challenge or diagnosis or issue at some point in our lives. And anxiety is technically a medical, term, a medically defined mental health issue. Anxiety is also a normal reaction to stress, difficult situations and circumstances, or it can be a real remnant of trauma. And I guess because I tend to talk more about stress, or I tend to talk more about psychological resilience or trauma-informed work, because I think there's less of a stigma. And also I think people relate to that. When we say anxiety, we can all get stressed. And our anxiety response or our stress responses kick in when we feel particularly uncomfortable. And I'm always looking for kind of gentler, more palatable ways of helping folks look at their mental health or their psychological resilience. And the last year, the divorce rates have gone up. Domestic violence has gone up. I mean, the helplines in the US and in the UK, I think they're experiencing something like 50 to 70% increase in calls over the last year, and it peaks at different times. Relationships are breaking down. People are feeling isolated. I mean, isolation, depression and anxiety is often a response to stress or isolation. And when we are in when we're experiencing that over a prolonged period of time, like uncertainty, it's absolutely going to have an impact on just how we feel, our general health and well-being. So I would say the secret is that we just build this stuff into our day-to-day life, psychological well-being, things that bring us joy. I talk a lot about that in coaching. What is it that brings you joy? Focus on that rather than focus on the thing that's stressing you. Because when our brain and our mind gets on that track gets fixated on, this is a problem, this is not a good challenge, this is a problem, there's a danger, there's a risk, or this could mean that, we all go down this rabbit hole when we get really worried about something or really concerned about something. That's an anxiety response. And that's when also we're likely then to kick into action and activity to make ourselves feel better. It's not necessarily going to get us what we want, which is to feel more relaxed, more comfortable, more confident, yeah, more at peace. So yes, the techniques I use are a lot to do with that self-soothing, self-awareness, self-care or self-compassion, as folks call it in the mindfulness community. And what is it that actually brings you joy? That's where you want to direct your focus, rather than on don't listen to the news every day. Don't listen to hours and hours upon news, of the COVID rates, the infection rates, the death rates. Yes, pay attention, but get facts, and don't listen to too much news or too much sensationalizing of what's happening.
I agree,
just
and
triggers it.
particularly where I think I've started to get myself into a habit of not really watching the news at all. I mean, I know that certain alerts will come up, and somebody said to me, well, if something big happens, someone will tell you. I think, to be honest, I'd rather start my day with a stretch and a bit of Duolingo language practice, and just and get into the right frame of mind. So as we near the end of what's been a great conversation, and we can tell how the difference in time zones has affected things, as the lights changing all the time here.
Yes.
We've got the emergency services.
Yes.
DC,
Yes.
all going on. Could you share what would be your sort of top tip you'd like to leave people with?
Whoa, leave people with. Whew, well, that's a good question, Denise. I really enjoyed our conversation. I do hope when folks listen to this that it brings, it's of great value to them too. It's always great connecting with you. And conversations like this, I love conversations like this, because it's through that dialogue, that we expand our own thinking. So thank you for giving me this opportunity, Denise, just to share this with you. I think I want to say a little something about resilience. Because there is, if we go down the route of toxic positivity or overly positive, and we consider resilience as just an ability to bounce back, then we're not really acknowledging some people's, some of the barriers, and often the invisible barriers around that. So there's a psychologist called Meg Jay, who says, he's just saying you're bouncing back from adversity. People don't feel understood. They don't feel seen in their complexity or all difficulties. Resilience is more of a heroic struggle. It's really a battle, not a bounce. And it's a process that can last for years. And so if we pace ourselves and we're in it for the long haul, it's a marathon, not a sprint, then it's so important to have just daily practices, things that we do regularly, that all the stuff that we've just talked about, grounding, anchoring, things that bring you joy, things that nurture you, and time to rest and repair, as well as those times to be bold and push the envelope, and step outside of your comfort zone. And one of my heroes, I guess you could say, is a woman called Audre Lorde. And if you don't know her, I definitely check her stuff out. She's a writer, a feminist, an activist, and an incredibly wise woman. And one of the things that she says about caring for herself, self-care, is caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. And for folks who particularly feel or notice they are part of any counterculture, or you just feel you're hitting your head up against a brick wall, and you're working with immovable objects, self-care is part of self-preservation, and it's absolutely imperative if you want to keep doing the work that you're doing, and you want to make an impact, in the areas that you work, or the communities that you serve, and the families that you live. Maybe that's what I would like to leave you with.
I like that. That's definitely one that's going to sit with me. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I now come on to the slightly more frivolous. I think it's got a very positive message to it. Where I always ask someone to leave us with a song that kind of comes moment for them, or is it something that empowers them, or whatever that might be for you?
Well, this was tricky. There's so many, because I love music. So there were so many songs that I could think of, but and there's a lot of classics, I'm sure, our International Women's Day. There's the Helen Reddy songs, there's the Aretha Franklin and Annie Lennox. So there's lots of songs that we could play that inspire us. But I wanted to pick this from an artist, a British artist called Leanna LaHavis. And I saw her live a few years ago at the Royal Albert Hall. And this is from her album called Blood, and it's fantastic. And one of the things, she just blew me away live. She did an arrangement of this song with her school choir. She brought the school that she attended, she brought her school choir on, and she brought her singing teacher on to conduct the choir. And she played this live in the Royal Albert Hall. And the thing that struck me about that was, here was a young woman who's been very successful so far in her life, and she was giving credit to the women that had inspired her, and her singing teacher was one of those women. And I think, for those of us that are have got to a place in our life where we feel privileged, we feel we have a level of success, we feel like we have a level of insight, I think there's something so important about encouraging the younger generations of men and women to respect themselves, respect each other, and work towards inclusion and unity and collaboration rather than violence and abuse and war. So this song for me is called is meaningful. It's called Unstoppable. And every time I hear this, I just feel inspired and my heart is warmed.
Fantastic. That's one, obviously, for performing rights reasons, we cannot play.
Oh.
If you sing, if you'd like, no, I know you're very creative, but it's definitely one. You can remind us again of the artist's name and the song.
Leanna LaHavis, and it's called Unstoppable. Listen to the whole album. It's wonderful. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, thanks, Cath. It's been a delight as ever to talk with you. I'm wishing you all the best with your move back over here. And I, for one, am looking forward to obviously having you back in London for more collaboration. But the collaboration doesn't stop there. And we're delighted to announce that we're going to be running a free exclusive webinar as part of Women's History Month. So that will be during March. And it's going to be on tools and techniques for radical self-care. So there'll be a link in the slide at the end of this conversation, and also details on my website. So we look forward to sharing the details with that and hopefully seeing you all there.
Yeah, wonderful. And the next time I see you, we'll be in the same time zone, Denise.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank
you. Thank you so much. And I love the concept behind this. And I hope lots of people listen to all of your broadcasts and conversations. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you.